On the morning of June 5, 1960, the sun rose over Lake Bodom in southern Finland. It was a quiet Sunday, the kind of day where the air carried the scent of pine trees and cold water, where birdsong rippled across the stillness. At the lake's shore, a small tent stood, pitched not far from the edge of the woods. Inside that tent lay 4 teenagers, 2 boys, 2 girls, fast asleep after a night beneath the stars. They were young, full of life, and dreaming of nothing more dangerous than what summer might bring. But by the time that same sun was high enough to paint the surface of the lake in silver, 3 of them would be dead. Slashed, bludgeoned, and stabbed in a frenzy of violence that would shake Finland for decades to come. One would survive, barely. And the mystery of what really happened on the shores of Lake Bodom that night would haunt the country forever. The story of the Lake Bodom murders is not only one of brutality, but of silence. Of secrets that drowned in that water and shadows that still hang over the people who lived. It is a story that begins innocently, with 4 friends chasing the simple joys of youth, and ends with investigators staring into a crime scene so savage, so confusing, that it continues to baffle experts more than 60 years later. The 4 teenagers were Seppo and Tero Boiman, 18 years old. He was strong, good-natured, a boy with a reputation for being dependable. His girlfriend, Tillikki Maki, only 15, bright-eyed, cheerful, and excited for the summer. Then there was Nils Gustafsson, also 18, a young man with a playful spirit, and his girlfriend, Mila Bjorklund, 17, blonde and kind, known among friends for her warmth. Together, the 4 of them planned what should have been a simple camping trip. A weekend of swimming, of laughter, of roasting food by the fire. They borrowed a small green tent and set it up near the edge of Lake Bodom, at a spot that was both hidden enough for privacy and open enough to watch the lake shimmer beneath the evening light. They laughed, told stories, and as darkness came down, they drifted to sleep, completely unaware of the horror about to descend upon them. At some point during the night, no one knows exactly when, the peace was shattered. Someone approached their tent. No one saw him. No one heard footsteps in the grass. What came next was sudden, brutal, and merciless. The tent was slashed open from the outside, ripped apart by a knife. What had been a shelter became a trap. Before they could even stand, the teenagers were under attack. Blades drove through fabric, striking bodies inside. A heavy, blunt object, possibly a rock, or perhaps the handle of a knife, came down with crushing force. The killer was not content with stabbing. He bludgeoned. He stabbed again. The violence was frenzied, chaotic, almost animalistic. When the attack was over, 3 of the 4 lay dead. Seppo Boiman, stabbed multiple times, his body left twisted beside the shredded tent. Tillikki Maki, murdered with a brutality far too much for her age. And Mila Bjorklund, stabbed and slashed dozens of times, far more than anyone else, as though the killer's rage was focused entirely on her. Her body was so mutilated that investigators later whispered she had been the primary target. Only one survived, Nils Gustafsson. But his survival came at a cost. His jaw was broken. His face was shattered. His tongue had nearly been cut through. He was beaten so badly that, when rescuers found him, his face was unrecognizable. He was lying on top of the collapsed tent, bloodied and unconscious, surrounded by the corpses of his friends. It was not a neighbor or passerby who discovered the horror. Instead, 2 young boys, out for a morning swim, stumbled across the scene. Imagine being 12 years old, expecting to find nothing more frightening than cold water, and instead, you see blood everywhere. Bodies tangled in the remains of a tent. A boy still alive, but barely, moaning in agony. The boys ran, screaming for help. Soon, adults from nearby cottages arrived. They quickly realized they were standing in the middle of something unspeakable. Finland, at the time, was considered one of the safest countries in the world. Violent murders were rare, especially ones this brutal. But here it was, undeniable, written in the blood-soaked grass beside Lake Bodom. Police arrived soon after. And what they found would only deepen the mystery. The crime scene was chaos. The tent was shredded, the ground covered in blood. But certain details made no sense. The teenagers' belongings were scattered. Shoes, wallets, clothes, missing. Stolen, perhaps. Yet other items, valuable ones, remained untouched. A strange selectiveness that made robbery seem unlikely. The murder weapon was nowhere to be found. No knife. No blunt object. Nothing but the carnage it had left behind. But then came the strangest discovery of all, the tent ropes. Whoever had committed this massacre had cut them cleanly, deliberately, collapsing the tent on top of the victims before leaving. But was it to humiliate them? To trap them further? Or was it simply the mark of a mind that wanted to leave behind confusion? And then there was Nils. Somehow alive. Barely conscious, bleeding heavily, but alive. His shoes were found a distance away, stained with blood. Whose blood no one knew. When doctors examined him, they said his injuries were consistent with a brutal attack by another person. His face had been beaten so badly it seemed impossible he could have done this to himself. But if he didn't, then who? The police began to investigate. But from the very beginning, mistakes were made. The crime scene was never properly sealed. Villagers, curious onlookers, even journalists wandered through the area. Evidence was trampled. Items were moved. Some reports even suggest that souvenirs were taken by people walking around the scene. It was, in every sense, contaminated. And in that contamination, the truth may have been lost forever. Rumors spread quickly. Some believed it was a local man, a recluse who lived near the lake and was known for strange behavior. Others whispered about a foreign soldier, perhaps a deserter, who had been seen in the area. And then there were darker suspicions that the survivor, Nils Gustafsson himself, might somehow have been involved. But at the time, investigators had nothing solid. Just bodies, blood, and 1,000 unanswered questions. The crime scene at Lake Bodom had been chaotic, but in the days that followed, chaos gave way to confusion. Police officers combed through the area, trying desperately to piece together what had happened that June night. The stillness of the lake contrasted cruelly with the violence that had unfolded there. The ground near the campsite was trampled with footprints, not just from the investigators, but perhaps from the killer themselves. Evidence was everywhere, but it was scattered, contradictory, and slippery, like water in their hands. The surviving boy, Nils Gustafsson, had been rushed to the hospital. His jaw was fractured, his face bruised, and his memory clouded by trauma. When asked what he remembered, Nils gave fragments of images. A shadowy figure, a blur, a sudden attack. But his testimony was unreliable. Doctors said his injuries were severe enough to cause confusion, even amnesia. For the police, it meant they had no clear eyewitness, only speculation. The first suspect. Almost immediately, suspicion turned outward. Finland was not known for brutal homicides. The idea that someone could butcher 3 teenagers at a peaceful lakeside campsite was unthinkable. Who would have the rage, or the motive? Witnesses came forward. A group of birdwatchers said they saw a blond man walking near the lake around dawn, just before the murders would have occurred. He was tall, lean, and looked strangely out of place. Some swore he was carrying something in his hands, perhaps a fishing pole, perhaps something else. But when sketches were drawn and circulated, the trail went cold. Nobody seemed to know this man. The first serious suspect was a local kiosk owner named Valdemar Gillström, who lived near Lake Bodom. Known to locals as the kiosk man, Gillström had a reputation for being bitter, aggressive, and hostile toward campers. He hated young people who drank and made noise near his property. He had even been seen throwing rocks at campers in the past. When rumors spread that he had been seen rowing a boat near the lake on the morning of the murders, suspicion hardened into accusation. Villagers whispered that he was violent, unpredictable, and perhaps capable of murder. But Gillström denied everything. He claimed he had been home that night, asleep. Police lacked hard evidence. And while suspicion lingered, nothing concrete tied him to the crime. For years, though, locals would exchange knowing glances whenever his name was mentioned. Then came a chilling twist. In 1969, 9 years after the murders, Gillström drowned in Lake Bodom. Officially, it was ruled a suicide. But rumors swirled that, before his death, he confessed to killing the teenagers. Others claimed he left no such admission, that it was mere gossip. The truth about Gyllström became another layer of mystery, an echo of guilt that could never be confirmed. A crime scene in shambles. Part of the problem was the bungled investigation. Police had allowed curious onlookers to trample the crime scene. Items were misplaced. Evidence was touched, moved, even stolen. The teens' belongings, wallets, clothes, even shoes, were scattered in odd places. Some things were missing entirely. The murder weapon itself was never found. Experts believed it to be a knife or some kind of sharp blade, combined with a blunt object. But without the weapon, everything remained guesswork. Even the time of the murders was debated. Some argued it happened just before dawn, others said much earlier. The evidence refused to settle neatly. The second wave of suspects. As years passed, the Lake Bodom murders became Finland's most infamous unsolved crime. Each passing decade seemed to bring new suspects. One man of interest was Hans Assmann, a German immigrant with a mysterious past. Assmann lived not far from Lake Bodom and was rumored to have connections to both the KGB and Nazi Germany. On the day after the murders, Assmann reportedly appeared at a Helsinki hospital, disheveled, with dirt under his fingernails and red stains on his clothes. Nurses later swore he looked like a man who had been involved in something violent. But doctors dismissed it, claiming the stains were from paint. Police investigated briefly, but no charges were filed. Still, the suspicion never fully faded. Assmann himself would later become a notorious name in Finland, tied to other unsolved crimes. Another possibility was that the attack had been random, a drifter or stranger passing through the area. But Finland in the 1960s had little of the transient crime seen in other countries. The brutality seemed too personal, too deliberate, to be the work of a passing stranger. The survivor becomes a suspect. Decades rolled on. The case went cold, but the legend of Lake Bodom grew. True crime enthusiasts speculated endlessly. Every detail was analyzed, every rumor magnified. Then, in 2004, more than 40 years after the murders, the unthinkable happened. Police arrested Nils Gustafsson, the sole survivor. For years, he had been seen as the traumatized victim, a boy who barely escaped with his life. But advances in DNA and forensic testing suggested something darker. Investigators claimed they found traces of blood evidence that did not match his original story. They argued that Nils, drunk and jealous, had gotten into a fight with his friends, perhaps over a girl, perhaps over an insult, and in a fit of rage, had killed them. His own injuries, police suggested, were self-inflicted or staged to make him appear a victim. The trial gripped Finland. Reporters filled the courtroom. Survivors from the 1960s came forward to testify. Experts clashed over the evidence. Prosecutors painted Nils as a man hiding a terrible secret for decades. The defense argued the case was built on speculation and unreliable science. In the end, the court acquitted Nils Gustafsson. There was not enough evidence to convict. He walked free, once again considered a victim, but now forever shadowed by suspicion. The case that never ends. Today, more than 6 decades after that night in June 1960, the Lake Bodom murders remain unsolved. No one has ever been convicted. Theories still swirl. Was it the bitter kiosk owner? The mysterious German with KGB ties? A random drifter? Or was it the boy who lived, carrying a hidden truth until his dying day? The lake itself has become a place of pilgrimage for the curious and the haunted. Tourists visit, not just for its beauty, but for the story, a story that refuses to die. At night, when the mist drifts across the water, locals say you can still feel the presence of those who never left. The Lake Bodom murders are more than just a case. They are a wound in Finland's history, a riddle without an answer, a reminder that sometimes the truth hides in shadows too deep for light to reach. For more than 4 decades, the Lake Bodom murders sat in Finland's collective memory like an open wound. 3 teenagers brutally murdered. 1 survivor, his story shifting and shadowed with doubt. And no resolution. Then, in March 2004, everything changed. Police stunned the nation when they announced the arrest of Nils Wilhelm Gustafsson, the sole survivor of that summer morning in 1960. The boy who had once been pitted, even celebrated for surviving a massacre, was now accused of being the killer all along. The revelation struck like lightning. Finland's media erupted. Was it possible? Could the young man who staggered from that blood-soaked campsite, jaw broken, tongue nearly severed, be the very one who committed the murders? The prosecution's story. The prosecutors painted a chilling narrative. On that June night, they argued the four teenagers had been drinking, laughing, perhaps a little reckless. But tension simmered beneath the surface. According to investigators, Gustafsson became jealous, angry at his girlfriend, Mila Ermeli Björklund, and perhaps resentful of the other boy, Seppo Bauman. That jealousy, they claimed, ignited into rage. In the darkness, Gustafsson turned violent. He struck Seppo first, then unleashed fury on the others. With a knife, with a blunt object, with unrelenting force, he slaughtered his friends. Then, according to the state's theory, he staged his own injuries to appear as the lone survivor. But there was a problem. How could a man inflict such catastrophic wounds upon himself? A fractured jaw, facial bones shattered, a concussion so severe he drifted in and out of consciousness? The prosecutors answered coldly, he didn't mean to. They suggested that during the frenzy, Gustafsson injured himself in the struggle, or that afterward, desperate to seal his cover story, he inflicted harm upon his own body. The evidence against him. The case hinged largely on DNA and forensic analysis, new tools unavailable in 1960. Investigators revisited Gustafsson's shoes, found discarded roughly 500 meters from the campsite. Forensic testing revealed blood from all three victims on the shoes. But strikingly, there was none of Gustafsson's own blood on them. To prosecutors, this was damning. They argued it proved Gustafsson wore the shoes during the murders, striking and stabbing his companions, and only later discarded them. The prosecution leaned heavily on this forensic revelation, weaving a story of betrayal, jealousy, and violence masked as survival. The defense strikes back. But Gustafsson's defense attorney, Jarmo Ristomaki, dismantled the accusations with quiet precision. First, he attacked the timeline. How could a 19-year-old boy, drunk and inexperienced, commit such a frenzied triple murder, and then deliberately wound himself so severely that he nearly died? Second, the defense brought in medical experts. They testified that Gustafsson's injuries were far too severe to have been self-inflicted. His broken jaw, his crushed facial bones, the loss of consciousness, all suggested he was the victim of an assault, not the orchestrator of one. And then came the blow that shook the courtroom. The defense argued that the blood evidence on the shoes could be explained by transfer. After the attack, in the chaos, Gustafsson's shoes may have been contaminated by contact with the victim's blood. In the open-air, trampled campsite, where clothing, bedding, and bodies were scattered, cross-contamination was not only possible, it was likely. Bit by bit, the foundation of the prosecution's case began to crumble. The verdict. The trial stretched for months, drawing national attention. For many Finns, it felt surreal, watching the last living link to that summer night sit accused of the most heinous crime in their history. But when the verdict came, it was clear. In October 2005, Nils Gustafsson was acquitted on all charges. The judges ruled that the evidence was insufficient, that the injuries he suffered could not be reconciled with the state's story. He was declared innocent, legally free, though forever bound to the mystery. A nation still haunted. The acquittal left Finland divided. Some saw Gustafsson as a man wrongfully accused, tormented not only by the trauma of survival but by decades of suspicion. Others whispered that justice had slipped away, that perhaps the true killer had sat in plain sight all along. And so, more than 60 years after that night, the Lake Bodom murders remain unsolved. A mystery carried through generations, whispered about on quiet summer nights by the water's edge. Even now, as the waves lap gently against the lake, some swear they hear echoes of screams carried across the dark Finnish pines. The ghosts of Bodom have never left.